how many of us are feeling anxious, worried, nervous, stressed? I am. I'm defending in August, so I'm right there with you all. So if you're here today because you've never done advocacy before or you've done it in the past and are just looking for some way to get involved, hopefully we can sort of take some of that anxious energy and give you a direction to go in. My name is Chris Dade. I'm a PhD candidate at UW-Madison and the 2024 Brad Fenwick Fellow for the Advancement of Civic Science with ASM. Today I'm going to give you just a little intro on me and why maybe you should trust me, that maybe I know a little thing or two about science advocacy, talk about why this concept of civic science matters, why we should care, talk about some of the challenges of science communication and engagement, discuss a little bit about what drives science polarization, sort of these trends that we're trying to work against, and maybe how our gut instinct as scientists to do communication might be the wrong approach. And then talk a little bit about what is effective. How do we actually do effective engagement? So I have done a lot, mostly at the state level, actually, in Missouri as an undergrad and now as a graduate student in Wisconsin. This is me. I organize a poster session every year for grad students to present their research work to state government policymakers here in Wisconsin. In 2017, I helped organize the March for Science in mid-Missouri. I actually did my master's in between my bachelor's and PhD in science communication. So I've done a little bit of thinking and reading around this area. Have participated at the congressional level with ASM on AMR advocacy, and also have recently founded a state-level science policy fellowship in Wisconsin. So this is kind of the background that I'm coming from. So why does this concept of civic science matter? You all are here, so you probably care about it, but if other people ask, why as scientists are we spending time outside the lab doing this advocacy? Why does that matter? Well, civic science as a concept is this idea that science can be a tool for civic empowerment, engagement, democratic action, and community engagement. Of course, I think I don't have to tell you all, right, that science, microbiology shapes our daily lives, shapes policy, public health. And I think it's important to remember, of course, that science has a contract with society, right? This is sort of agreement that governments, funders give scientists money to do research. And in exchange, we take what we discover in the lab and try and benefit society, translate that knowledge back out. But I think there's a legitimate question about whether or not this contract is breaking down. And I think some of us probably feel that, and I think that's probably true to some extent. And I think the first place a lot of people ask themselves that question is, this sort of question of, do people trust scientists anymore, right? There's this big question, I think, especially after the pandemic, about are we losing trust in science? And so we can look at the data on this. The Pew Center asks folks every year, how confident are you that scientists are engaging in the best interest of the public? And so you can watch in 2019, a majority of Americans have, a decent level of trust. Around 13% of Americans maybe distrust scientists in general. And then as you go along during the pandemic, okay, now there's a dip in trust. So that perception that there's a loss in trust is real to an extent. And then as we march along, it's recovered a little bit. But I would say we're not back to pre-pandemic levels of general trust in science. So that's one thing to note. But I think the other important thing to note is that trust is not gone. A majority of Americans trust scientists in general. So it's not that there's a lack of trust. So there's something deeper that's going on here. And that's kind of the challenge of science communication and engagement, which is that scientists are often not trained, right, in this communication and engagement work. So most Americans think that we're pretty smart. When asked, most Americans think that scientists are pretty intelligent, but they don't think we're very good at communicating. So just keep that in mind, that the public, again, trusts you all. They think you're smart. They think you're doing things in the interest of the public, but there may be a little less, trusting that you know how to communicate that work outside of the scientific field. The public is also hesitantly interested, I would say, in us doing engagement. So when asked, should scientists stay in the lab and just do research, or should they come out of the lab and do policy engagement work? A bare, majority of Americans say that scientists should take an active role in policy discussions and engagement. So I think that's an important context to keep in mind as well, is that the public is not looking to scientists to make policy decisions. A lot of us, because we are citizens of the countries we live in, are not just in the lab all day. We have an interest in policy. We have interest in political decisions, and we want to be involved. But the public is not clamoring for us to do this involvement. I think that's an important context to keep in mind. And you can break this down by political leaning as well. So again, you start to see this kind of partisan split between Democrats and Republicans in the US about how much they think scientists should be engaging in policy discussions. And along those same lines, science as an entity is becoming politicized. And what I mean by that is, we saw in terms of asking Democrats and Republicans, should scientists be involved in political engagement? There's a split there. If you look at general trust in science, you can see that especially during the pandemic and after the pandemic, there's now this sort of gap between Democrats and Republicans in the US in terms of how much they trust scientists to act in the general interest of the public. And I think we've all pretty familiar with this sign. I've seen it around a lot in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm sure you all have seen it a lot in your neighborhoods as well. I think a lot of us who maybe identify as politically liberal love these signs, right? There are a lot of good value statements there. But right there in green, science is real, on a sign with other political policy statements, I think we have to remember ties science to political positions and ties science to partisan identities in the US. So it's not just that, say, Republicans are politicizing science, but liberals and Democrats in the US have also tied science to their political movements as well. So it's a trend on both sides. And I think the critical thing is that as we start to do this engagement, as we start to do this work, and maybe you found this in your own personal work, is that giving facts, giving data, worrying about science education or science literacy isn't the answer. Facts don't change minds, and actually there's research out there that the more highly educated or the more scientifically competent folks are, the more likely they are to be polarized on polarized science topics. So there's a lot of work by legal scholar Dan Cahan at Yale, who's done a lot of work on this. So if you ask folks, do scientists agree that climate change is affecting our environment? Along the x-axis is this scale called ordinary science intelligence. So this is a measure of an individual's sort of general science knowledge, but also their ability to do mathematical and science reasoning. So the more highly scientifically capable someone is, the more likely they are to answer this question correctly. But when you break this down by political identity, an interesting trend occurs. So the more ordinary science intelligence someone has, but the more conservative or Republican they lean, or the more Democrat and liberal they lean, the further they are apart and the less likely they are to answer this question the same way. And so this is an important trend that we'll talk about a little bit later about identity and how that comes into science polarization. But just remember that facts, science education alone is not going to solve this problem. The critical thing, though, is that this is only true for issues that are already polarized. So this is a slightly different question, but when you ask people how risky or how much risk do certain issues pose to the public, on issues along the top like climate change, gun violence, other issues that are polarized, say in the American political context, you see this split between Democrats and Republicans. But on other issues, say like nanotechnology, GMOs even, you don't see a polarized split. So it's sort of two questions. Is one, how can we work to make sure that science, microbiology in general doesn't sort of fall into this valley of polarization or partisanship? And two, if it does, then we have to do a lot of work that isn't just giving people more facts and data, but is really engaging at a deeper level to get out of this valley of polarization. Because again, as we see, more facts, more data, more science education actually can increase the gap and where people are at. So those are the challenges, and I think to think about how do we get over those challenges, we have to understand what drives, again, I think that maybe shocking trend that polarization can increase when folks are more, let's say, scientifically literate or competent. And so as we look at understanding polarization, there are sort of two concepts that are important to keep in mind. One is motivated reasoning. This is this idea that all of us, any human, is going to unconsciously process information that already to align with things that we already believe, values that we already have. This is just something that humans do innately. And on top of that is this trend or this concept called cultural cognition theory. And again, this was developed by Dan Kahan and other scholars. And the concept basically is this, that motivated reasoning drives folks to take positions on science policy issues or other policy issues that protects their membership in their social groups. So we as humans are social creatures. We like to be in groups. We don't like to be alone. And so if, say, taking a position on a science policy issue, whether that's vaccinating your kids or wearing a mask or approving a nuclear power plant, whatever it may be, if that threatens your membership in your social groups, even if the data tells you this is the policy that you should take or the action that you should take, someone is going to default to taking actions and espousing beliefs that protect their membership in a social group. And this is true whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, a liberal or conservative. This is just an innate fact of us being social creatures. I think it's also important to remember that we as scientists are a group, and we are a weird group, right? So I'll give the context for US data. It's true for basically every country. Less than half of Americans have a 4-year degree equivalent or higher, bachelor's degree or higher. And only 2 to 3% of Americans even have a PhD, right? I'm standing here, I don't even have a PhD yet. So, we are a weird group. Our education, our training is not something that is common amongst all Americans. Our habits, our way of thinking don't make us better. And I think a lot of scientists sometimes approach unintentionally conversations around policy in the sense that I know better, I have more education, and so therefore you should listen to me. But again, we are the odd ones out. We are not the average normal people. And that doesn't make us better, it just makes us different. And I think that's important to remember as well. And I think it's also critical to remember that we as scientists don't think like scientists 24 hours a day. Some of the people in this room have heard this anecdote. I call it the oatmeal bowl anecdote, which is that in general, it is more efficient to run your dishwasher more often, even though it might be half full, than to hand wash all of your dishes every day. I know this. I know the data's out there. I've heard the results, etc. And yet every morning before I go to lab, before I go to work, there's me hand washing my bowl that I have my morning oats in, because that's just like habit forming for me. That's something that I, at 8:30 in the morning, I'm not thinking about what does the data say? What is the most optimized thing? What do the most recent results say about this? We as scientists professionally think about what the data is, think about what the evidence is, try and make decisions that are informed by data professionally. But no one has the time or the energy or the training to do that 24 hours a day. And we, as professional scientists, don't do that either. And so when we see other people in policy and society making decisions that aren't necessarily driven by data, or we don't think are driven by data or evidence, we have to remember that that's okay, because we don't make all of our decisions that way too. And we shouldn't judge people or sort of say that those are invalid decisions just because it's not evidence informed. So that's a lot of there are challenges, we're doing this wrong, we're thinking about it wrong, we're weird. Where do we start, right? Man, all of my gut assumptions or my tweets that I've sent out before, or conversations that I've had, I've been doing this all wrong, and that's okay because I have done this too. So you are not alone. This is just our gut reaction. But it's okay, because a lot of people think a lot about this. How can we do science communication better? And we're going to talk through some of those things that are effective. So the first is this idea of cultural competence. You have to meet people where they are, right? This is this idea of knowing your audience, but it's not just knowing who your audience is, but knowing them at a deeper level. And part of that is asking yourself, where does mistrust come from, right? When someone is not following the science, or they're making decisions that you as a professional scientist think aren't in line with the scientific evidence is, you have to ask yourself, where is that mistrust? Where is that skepticism coming from? This is a paper that just came out this year, sort of looking at cultural cognition and sort of levels of mistrust. Some people have mistrust in elites in general, right? Those of us that are highly educated, that are policymakers. And so that's a system-wide sort of mistrust polarization. That's different than, say, folks that have had a bad experience at a doctor, and so therefore are skeptical of the medical establishment. Or maybe they're a parent who's really worried about their kid's health, and so they're skeptical about vaccination claims, but are otherwise perfectly fine following other scientific areas. So there's a sort of pyramid from system as a whole to science in general, specific policy areas, or even specific science claims that folks might have distrust or might not readily engage with or believe the facts. And it's important to sort of try and understand where that skepticism might be coming from. So civic science calls us to think about doing communication and communicating science not for the public, right? Not to or at the public, but with the public. And that means conversation and dialogue. And so how do we go about that? One, I think cannot be stressed enough, and it might seem obvious, but I think it's really important to say, is you have to listen first. Curiosity is what we are trained as scientists to do, right? In the lab, how many of us can remember those, well, that was kind of weird moments, right? You're looking at data, you're looking at a result, and you're like, this is not at all what I expected. And so you go chasing that because as a scientist, you're curious. Now think about those conversations or people you've met that have a reaction to the science or to data or policy that you say, well, wait, that's weird. Why do you as a parent not want to vaccinate your kids for X, Y, or Z? Why are you opposed to building more solar panels on farmland in Wisconsin? And instead of shutting down and saying, well, you're not listening to the science, so you're not worthy of engaging, what if we were curious and ask, well, why are you reacting that way? What is driving that? What is beneath the hood of that initial reaction? And try and understand and get to know that person better. Find common ground, right? Again, we are social creatures, and a lot of us have a lot in common with other people. Not our education oftentimes, not our professional background, but there are lots of things that are not science and not education that you have in common with other people. Maybe it's that you go to the same religious practices. Maybe it's that you enjoy the same sports teams or live in the same neighborhoods or your kids are the same age. All sorts of moral values, politics that aren't science and aren't policy, that you can find those common grounds to start building those connections, are how you make people that you're engaging with not feel like they're part of another group than you, but you are part of the same group. And I think it's also important along those same lines that you work on building trust first. Facts and data do not change minds. Relationships, trust, do. Facts and data will never change minds until people trust you, until they trust that you are looking out for their best interest and you are, again, part of their same social group and that you're not sort of an other, that you're sort of in opposition to them. And start small. It can feel really overwhelming. There's a lot out there. There's a lot of disagreement. I think there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of divide in our society right now. And it sort of feels so overwhelming that you want to tackle it all at once. But really, again, trust is built conversation by conversation at the individual level. So whether it's at your city council level, at the state level, a lot of states have state science academies of science that are doing this type of engagement work. Any small acts, people in your life that you know that you can have those conversations with, maybe your parents or your siblings or aunts and uncles that you dread having conversations at Thanksgiving with, maybe we get curious and ask ourselves, how can we have those conversations that are productive? And so just some takeaways and resources. Again, civic science is about empowering communities, building trust, and making science a public good. Science is political in the sense that, well, we live in a society, which is sort of a joke, but again, we're funded by governments. People make decisions about what science is done. We, as scientists, are citizens of countries. So it is political, but it doesn't have to be partisan. And so how do we work to make science nonpartisan or get out of polarized partisan discussions on science? Polarization is often about values and worldviews, not ignorance. So engagement is a skill we can all develop, but we have to remember that the people that might be seeming in opposition to us, it's not because they're less educated, it's not because they're not as smart as us. There's something deeper there that is more human. And so how do we as humans, and not just professional scientists, engage with that? And so some good resources, ASM, public engagement and advocacy resources are a great opportunity, whether they can run workshops, engagement opportunities. The ASM Action Center is a great place to learn more. And so there's my contact information, my email, the advocacy email. Happy to continue those conversations here at ASM and also offline. Thank you.